You know that moment when you're sitting at dinner, talking with people you know, or simply sharing your thoughts, and someone suddenly makes a remark that changes the atmosphere. Maybe they dismiss what you said, make you the target of a joke, or slip an insult into the conversation and hide it behind a laugh. It happens quickly. You barely have time to decide how you feel before you're already choosing between laughing it off, staying silent, or saying something sharp enough to make them regret it. You choose a response. The conversation moves on, and everyone else seems to forget, except you. Later, when you're alone, the scene starts playing again. You remember their exact words, the tone they used, the way people reacted, and then your mind supplies the response you wish you'd given. Something calmer, something sharper, something that would have ended the conversation on your terms. For a few minutes, you win an argument that no longer exists. And that is what makes disrespect so strangely powerful. The person who caused the moment may forget it before the day is over, while you carry it long after they have moved on. Someone can speak to you without respect, but they cannot decide what those words mean about you. That judgment still belongs to you. Once you see that, dealing with disrespect becomes less about finding the perfect comeback and more about understanding what happens inside you when someone tries to provoke you. A calm response does not mean accepting humiliation. Silence does not always mean weakness, and walking away does not mean you lost. Sometimes you need to speak firmly. Sometimes you need to set a boundary. Sometimes the wisest response is to give the situation nothing more than the attention it deserves. The deeper skill is learning to recognize disrespect without allowing another person's lack of control to become your own. Because when you stop treating every insult as a battle you have to win, the situation changes. You are no longer fighting to control the other person. You are learning to remain in control of yourself. There is a particular discomfort that comes with being disrespected in front of other people. Someone makes a remark, and for a brief second, you are no longer simply listening to a conversation. You become aware of yourself through the eyes of everyone around you. You notice who heard it, who laughed, who stayed silent, and whether anyone seems to be waiting for your response. The words may have been simple, but suddenly they seem to carry a much larger meaning. They can make you feel exposed, reduced, or challenged. That reaction is worth understanding, because if you do not understand it, you may spend your energy fighting the wrong problem. Often, the deepest wound is not the insult itself. It is the interpretation that arrives with it. If someone dismisses your opinion, the mind can quickly turn that moment into a statement about your intelligence. If someone mocks your appearance, your work, or your ambitions, the comment can begin to feel like evidence that other people see you as inadequate. A careless joke can become a question about your place in the group. The mind does this almost automatically. It takes an external event and attaches a judgment to it, then reacts to the judgment as though it were an established fact. That is why two people can hear the same criticism and experience completely different emotions. The words are outside them. The meaning they give those words is where the real struggle begins. This does not mean you should become indifferent to everything people say. That would be another form of weakness, because refusing to hear criticism can make you blind to your own mistakes. A person who never allows uncomfortable information to reach them cannot grow very far. Stoic discipline is more precise than simple emotional numbness. It asks you to separate what happened from the story you immediately built around what happened. Someone spoke disrespectfully, that is one fact. They must be trying to humiliate me. Everyone must think less of me, and I have to prove myself right now, are additional judgments. They may feel true in the moment, but feelings do not automatically make interpretations accurate. Consider what changes when you create even a small space between those two things. Someone makes a cutting remark. You notice the sting, but you do not immediately turn the sting into a command. You hear the words. You observe your body becoming tense. You notice the urge to answer quickly. None of that requires you to act yet. That pause may last only a few seconds, but it changes the quality of your response. Instead of being pulled along by the other person's emotional energy, you begin observing what is happening within you. This is a quiet form of strength. You are not suppressing anger. You are refusing to let anger make the decision before your judgment has had a chance to speak. The Stoics placed enormous importance on this distinction because human freedom becomes very small when every outside event can dictate your inner state. If someone praises you, you feel valuable. If someone insults you, you feel worthless. If someone respects you, you feel secure. If someone dismisses you, you feel threatened. Your emotional life then becomes a kind of public property, constantly changing according to whoever happens to enter the room. That is exhausting. A stranger's opinion, a co-worker's sarcasm, or a relative's careless comment should not become the measuring instrument for your character. At the same time, maintaining inner stability does not require you to tolerate repeated disrespect. This distinction matters because calmness can easily be misunderstood. You can remain composed and still recognize that someone's behavior is unacceptable. You can feel anger and still choose a measured response. You can decide that a relationship is unhealthy without needing to hate the person involved. Control does not mean becoming passive. It means choosing your action from a place of judgment rather than from the pressure to immediately relieve your emotional discomfort. Sometimes that action will be a clear boundary. Sometimes it will be a brief correction. Sometimes it will be leaving the conversation. The important part is that the choice belongs to you. Once you see this, disrespect begins to look different. It is still unpleasant. It may still hurt, but it no longer automatically becomes a threat to your identity. The person in front of you can say what they want, and you can decide what deserves to enter your mind. Their behavior can tell you something about them without becoming a definition of you. Their opinion can be heard without being obeyed. Their attempt to provoke you can be recognized without becoming your emotional assignment. That is where psychological presence begins to develop. You stop disappearing into the reaction and remain present enough to see the situation clearly. And this is why the first victory happens before you speak. It happens in the moment when you realize that another person's lack of restraint does not require a matching lack of restraint from you. You do not need to prove that you are intelligent because someone called you foolish. You do not need to prove that you are confident because someone tried to embarrass you. You do not need to restore your status with a sharper insult. Your dignity is not something another person can remove with a sentence. They can challenge it, misunderstand it, or attempt to provoke you. But the final decision about how you carry yourself remains yours. Once that becomes clear, your response stops being a reflex and becomes a choice. And that small difference is where real control begins. If this way of thinking has given you something useful, consider subscribing. It is a way of continuing these reflections and returning to the principles that become most valuable when life gives you a reason to forget them. Once you recognize that another person's behavior does not define you, a more difficult issue appears. What are you actually trying to accomplish when you react? The question matters because anger can disguise itself as principle. You may tell yourself that you're standing up for your dignity, when part of you simply wants the other person to feel the discomfort they created. You want them to regret speaking. You want the room to see that they chose the wrong person to challenge. Seneca captured this hidden cost of emotional reactions with a simple observation: we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. If you do not notice what is happening beneath your reaction, your response can become less about protecting your dignity and more about making someone else suffer. Think about what happens when an insult lands and you answer immediately. The other person says something sharp. You return something sharper. They defend themselves. You explain why they deserved your response. They find another weakness and attack again. Now the original comment is almost irrelevant. What began as a few careless words has become a contest over who can control the conversation. Your attention narrows, your voice changes, and your body becomes tense. You are trying to win the emotional exchange. The strange part is that the other person may have wanted exactly this. They may not have planned it consciously, but once you become reactive, they have gained access to your attention, your mood, and your behavior. That is why immediate retaliation can feel powerful while making you less free. For a few seconds you may experience relief. You finally said what you were thinking. You put them in their place. You watched their expression change. But relief is not always the same thing as resolution. Anger promises closure and delivers another reason to keep thinking about the situation. Afterward, you may wonder whether you were too harsh, whether you should have said something else, or whether the other person now thinks less of you. You have won a moment and lost an evening. Stoic discipline approaches this differently. Before deciding what another person deserves, you first decide what kind of response you want to be responsible for. That distinction gives you back something more valuable than the last word. It gives you choice. A pause is not empty space. It is the small distance between an event and your judgment about it. Someone speaks. You notice the anger. You let the first impulse rise without immediately obeying it. Then you consider what action would still make sense if you were calm. It prevents the loudest emotion in the room from making decisions. You can even test your response with a simple standard. Will this action improve the situation, protect a legitimate boundary, or preserve my principles? If the answer is yes, speak. Speak clearly. If someone has crossed a line, you can tell them so without turning your sentence into a weapon. If they are spreading something false about you, correct the fact without adding an insult. If they continue after you have made yourself clear, change your distance from them. But if the only purpose of your response is to make them feel small because they made you feel small, pause again. That is not self-respect directing you, that is wounded pride asking for repayment. This is where many people confuse strength with intensity. A louder voice can look stronger. A faster comeback can look smarter. A devastating insult can feel satisfying. Yet none of these things prove that you are in control. Anyone can react when their emotions are activated. The harder skill is remaining capable of choosing when your emotions are demanding immediate action. Sometimes that means saying less than you could. Sometimes it means allowing an awkward silence to remain awkward. Sometimes it means ending the conversation before it becomes something you will later regret. Restraint can feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is not evidence that it is wrong. There is also a subtle psychological shift that happens when you stop treating every provocation as an invitation. You begin to notice that not every comment requires your participation. A person can throw a remark into the room and leave you with the choice of whether to catch it. A brief look, a calm sentence, or simply continuing what you were doing can sometimes end a situation faster than 10 minutes of explanation. Still, there are moments when refusing to respond would create its own problem. Someone may repeatedly disrespect you because they have learned that you will absorb it quietly. In that situation, deliberate action may require a firm response. The difference is the source of that response. You are not speaking because you need to release anger. You are speaking because a boundary needs to be made clear. Your words become simpler, and your voice does not need to compete. You state what happened, what you will accept, and what you will do if the behavior continues. Then you stop. The goal, then, is not to become impossible to offend. That would be unrealistic. Words can hurt, especially when they come from someone whose opinion matters to you. Emotional control does not erase that human response. It gives you enough space to decide what happens next. You can feel anger without becoming cruel. You can feel embarrassed without becoming defensive. You can feel the desire to retaliate and still choose a response that serves the person you want to be. That is a deeper form of power because it does not depend on controlling the other person. And once you experience that kind of control, something begins to change in the way you enter difficult conversations. You become less eager to prove yourself and more attentive to what is actually happening. You listen for intention, but you do not obsess over it. You notice patterns. You notice who respects a boundary and who keeps testing it. You notice when a conversation can be repaired and when continuing only creates another cycle. Your calm becomes practical rather than performative. It helps you see choices that anger would have hidden. The person who provoked you may interpret your restraint as weakness. That is acceptable. Your goal is not to control their interpretation of you. Your goal is to remain responsible for your own conduct. Once you understand that, the need to answer every challenge begins to fade. You can still defend yourself when defense is necessary in the end. You can still speak firmly when firmness is deserved, but you no longer confuse reaction with strength. You begin to understand that the most important battle is decided in the few seconds before you respond, when you choose whether someone else's behavior will determine what kind of person you become. There is a point where restraint stops being useful if it is misunderstood as permission. You can remain calm while someone speaks carelessly to you, but calmness does not require you to keep accepting the same behavior. This is where self-respect becomes more precise. You are not trying to become harder, colder, or more aggressive. You are learning to make your position clear without allowing anger to take control of the conversation. That distinction matters because there is a difference between avoiding conflict and refusing unnecessary conflict. You stay quiet because you are afraid of what might happen if you speak. Deliberate restraint comes from choice. You know you could respond, but you decide that the situation does not deserve a response yet. A boundary requires the same kind of choice. You are not speaking because you need to prove that you are strong. You are speaking because something important needs to be made clear. The words can therefore be simple. You do not need a speech. You do not need to list every offense from the last 6 months. You can say that you do not appreciate being spoken to that way, that a certain subject is off limits, or that you are willing to continue the conversation when it becomes respectful. Then, you let the silence after your words do some of the work. This can feel strangely uncomfortable at first because many people have learned to associate boundaries with confrontation. They picture raised voices, angry expressions, accusations, and dramatic endings. But a boundary does not need emotional force behind it. In fact, the calmer it is, the more clearly it can communicate that you have already made your decision. Consider someone who repeatedly makes jokes about your work whenever other people are around. The first few times, you might ignore it. Eventually, you might speak to them privately and explain that you do not want those comments directed at you anymore. There is no need to insult their character or diagnose their insecurity. You simply identify the behavior and state your position. If they respect it, the problem may end there. If they become defensive, mock you again, or act as though your boundary is unreasonable, you have learned something useful about the relationship. That information is important because boundaries are not only instructions for other people, they are also information for you. They show you what happens when you communicate clearly. A respectful person may disagree with your boundary, but they can still recognize that it belongs to you. A person who repeatedly ignores it is showing you that the problem is not a misunderstanding. Their behavior is becoming a pattern. Once you see the pattern, you no longer have to keep searching for the perfect sentence that will finally make them understand. Sometimes understanding is not missing, willingness is. This is one reason Stoic discipline can be misunderstood as passive acceptance. The aim is not to become a person who allows anyone to do anything without consequence. The aim is to make sure your actions remain guided by judgment rather than emotional pressure. If someone crosses a line, you can respond. You can protect yourself. You can create distance. You can end access to your time and attention. What you do not need is the extra burden of hatred. Anger may tell you that you must make the other person suffer, before you can feel whole again. Wisdom asks something quieter. What action actually solves the problem? Sometimes the answer is a firm sentence. Sometimes it is reduced contact. Sometimes it is leaving an environment where disrespect has become normal. Notice how different this feels from trying to win. Winning requires an opponent to lose. A boundary requires only that you know where you stand. That is why a calm boundary can carry more psychological weight than an angry confrontation. When you speak with control, there is less material for them to use as a distraction. Your message remains visible. You are not attacking them. You are describing what you will and will not participate in. The responsibility then shifts back to them. They can respect it or ignore it, but their choice no longer needs to determine the clarity of yours. There will still be situations where someone deliberately tries to provoke you after you have spoken. They may laugh, call you sensitive, accuse you of overreacting, or suddenly behave as though your boundary is the real problem. This is where the temptation to explain yourself becomes especially strong. You want them to understand your reasons. You want everyone nearby to recognize that you are justified. But a boundary becomes weaker when it depends on getting unanimous approval. You can explain yourself once when useful and necessary. After that, repeating the argument can turn your boundary into a negotiation. You are not required to convince someone that your limits are reasonable before you are allowed to have them. The same principle applies internally. You may worry afterward that you were too firm, too distant, or too direct. Reflection is useful, but self-doubt should not become another form of surrender. Being calm does not mean feeling completely comfortable. Sometimes doing the right thing leaves you uncomfortable because you are breaking an old habit of keeping everyone else satisfied. Over time, this changes the way people experience you, not because you become intimidating and not because you develop some mysterious ability to control a room. People simply begin to notice that your reactions are consistent. You do not explode over small things, but you also do not tolerate repeated disrespect indefinitely. You speak when something matters. You remain quiet when speaking would only feed the conflict. You follow through when a boundary is crossed. That consistency creates clarity. Others no longer have to guess what version of you will appear when pressure rises, because you have stopped allowing pressure to decide for you. And there is something freeing about reaching that point. You stop measuring your strength by how forcefully you can respond. You start measuring it by how faithfully you can act according to your principles while someone else is acting according to theirs. You can remain respectful without becoming submissive. You can remain firm without becoming cruel. You can leave without making the departure dramatic. Most importantly, you can allow another person's behavior to reveal their character without feeling responsible for correcting it. Your task is to decide what you will participate in, what you will address, and what you will walk away from. Once that becomes clear, a boundary stops feeling like a weapon. It becomes a quiet statement of self-command, and the person on the other side is free to show you what they do with it. A boundary becomes meaningful when you are willing to act on it, and that is where things can become uncomfortable. You may calmly tell someone that you will not accept being spoken to that way, only to discover that they have no intention of respecting what you said. They interrupt again. They make another joke. They question your right to be offended. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about the original behavior. It becomes a debate about whether your boundary is reasonable. This is the point where many people get pulled into explaining themselves over and over, hoping that if they can just find the right words, the other person will finally understand. But understanding is not always the problem. Sometimes the person understands perfectly well. They simply do not care enough to change. Epictetus expressed the principle clearly. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Your boundary does not become less valid because someone refuses to respect it. What matters is what you choose to do once their response makes their position clear. That distinction can save you a great deal of wasted energy. When someone genuinely misunderstands you, clarification can help. You explain what you meant, listen to their response, and perhaps the tension disappears. But when someone keeps challenging a clearly stated boundary, another explanation may only create another opportunity for them to argue. You explain why the comment bothered you. They explain why you should not be bothered. You give another example. They challenge the example. You defend yourself again, and suddenly you are standing in a courtroom that nobody asked you to enter, presenting evidence for the right to control your own life. The longer it continues, the more the original issue disappears beneath layers of debate. This is why knowing when to stop talking is a form of discipline. Silence after a clear statement can feel uncomfortable because the mind wants resolution. It wants the other person to acknowledge your position, admit that they were wrong, and perhaps even apologize. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it does not. Your peace cannot depend on receiving the response you hoped for. If you have communicated clearly, the next useful piece of information may come from what the other person does rather than what they say. Their behavior becomes the answer. They may respect the boundary. They may test it again. They may become hostile. They may simply move on. Each response tells you something about the relationship, and you do not need to argue with the evidence. This is where leaving becomes more powerful than it first appears. Walking away is often treated as something people do when they have run out of arguments, as though staying in the room proves confidence and leaving proves defeat. But that assumes every disagreement is a competition with a winner waiting at the end. Life does not work that way. Some conversations produce understanding, others produce nothing except exhaustion. Continuing a conversation simply because you have not yet convinced the other person is not necessarily persistence. It can be attachment to an outcome you cannot control. You can see this in ordinary situations. Someone keeps making personal comments during a gathering after you have already asked them to stop. You could spend another 20 minutes explaining why their behavior is inappropriate. You could try to expose the contradiction in their reasoning. You could wait for them to admit that they crossed a line. Or you could recognize that the useful part of the conversation has already happened. You made your position clear. They made theirs clear through their behavior. At that point, stepping away is not surrender. It is a decision about where your attention belongs. The same principle applies in professional settings, family relationships, friendships, and casual interactions. You will sometimes encounter people who treat every disagreement as an invitation to dominate. They interrupt, change the subject, exaggerate what you said, and then attack the version of your position they created. If you follow them through every distortion, you may spend the entire conversation defending statements you never made. The trap is subtle because it feels like you are protecting yourself. In reality, you may be allowing someone else to set the terms of the interaction. They decide the subject, the pace, the emotional temperature, and how long the exchange continues. Your attention becomes the resource they keep consuming. Psychological presence means noticing that shift before it carries you too far. You can hear yourself becoming desperate to be understood. You can notice the urge to send another message, make another phone call, or deliver one final explanation. That urge deserves observation, not automatic obedience. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the last one you already said. Sometimes there is nothing left to clarify. You are simply waiting for another person to give you permission to stop participating, and they never have to give it. Stoic discipline becomes practical here because it brings your attention back to the part of the situation that remains yours. You cannot force another person to respect your boundary. You cannot make them apologize sincerely. You cannot guarantee that they will tell the story fairly afterward. You can decide whether you will stay in the conversation. You can decide whether you will answer the message. You can decide how much access someone receives to your time and attention. Those choices may seem small, but repeated choices of this kind shape the quality of your life. Peace is often protected through ordinary decisions that no one else notices. Leaving also does not require hostility. You do not need to announce that you are done with someone forever. You do not need a dramatic final statement that proves how little you care. In many cases, the calmer approach is almost boring. You finish what you need to finish, excuse yourself, change the subject, end the call, or simply stop responding. The lack of drama can feel strange because part of you may want the other person to understand that they pushed you too far. But that desire itself can keep you attached to the situation. If you leave while secretly waiting for them to chase you, regret their behavior, or recognize your strength, you are still looking back. Real detachment is quieter. You leave because staying no longer serves a purpose. You create distance without needing approval, revenge, or recognition. The decision stands on its own because your attention is yours to direct, and peace is yours to protect. Walking away can end a conversation without ending the conversation inside your head. You leave the room, continue with your day, and tell yourself that it is finished. But later, when everything becomes quiet, the scene returns. You remember the exact words. You remember the tone. You remember who was standing nearby and the expression on someone's face. Then your mind begins editing the past. You think of the sentence you should have used, the calm response that would have stopped everything, or the sharper answer that would have left the other person speechless. For a moment, it can feel as though you are finally taking back control, but you are still responding to a conversation that no longer exists. The original moment may have lasted less than a minute, yet your mind can keep extending it for hours. The other person may have gone home, watched television, eaten dinner, and forgotten the entire exchange. Meanwhile, you are still arguing with them in your imagination. You are explaining yourself to an imaginary audience. You are proving that you were right. You are rewriting their reaction and constructing a version of the conversation where you finally say everything perfectly. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. None of this changes what happened. It only gives the past another opportunity to occupy the present. The Stoic approach brings your attention back to a simple distinction: what is happening now, not what happened 3 hours ago, not what you wish you had said, not what the other person might say next week. Right now, the conversation is over. The person is somewhere else. You are somewhere else. Your body is sitting in a different place. Your attention is available for something else, and the moment that caused the anger has already passed. The mind may continue presenting the old scene as though it requires another response, but a memory does not become a present event simply because it feels vivid. The point is not to become indifferent. It is to become selective about what deserves your attention now. This is where psychological presence becomes a practical skill. When the scene returns, you do not have to fight the memory or force yourself to stop thinking about it. That often makes the thought stronger. Instead, you can notice what is happening without following it further. You can recognize the familiar sequence. The memory appears, anger rises, your mind creates a better response, and then you begin rehearsing the argument again. Once you can see that pattern, you have a choice. You can continue feeding it, or you can return your attention to the life that is actually happening around you. This choice may sound small, but repeated choices shape the way your mind responds to future events. If you constantly rehearse every insult, your mind learns that disrespect deserves prolonged attention. If you examine the event briefly, take the lesson, and release the rest, you teach yourself something different. You teach yourself that an uncomfortable moment can end when the external event ends. This does not make you careless. It makes your attention more selective. Your mind becomes less willing to hand over hours of your life to someone who may have spent only seconds trying to provoke you. These imaginary arguments can become addictive because they offer the illusion of control. In reality, you could not control the original conversation, but inside your imagination, you can control every detail. You can finally say the perfect sentence. You can make the other person understand. You can make everyone recognize that you were right. The fantasy feels satisfying because it repairs the helplessness of the original moment, but it also keeps you emotionally connected to the person who upset you. You are still asking them, even in your imagination, to acknowledge your power. That means they are still occupying a position inside your mind. Real control does not require the imaginary opponent to surrender. It requires you to stop needing the surrender. You can accept that the conversation did not go perfectly. You can accept that you were caught off guard. You can even accept that you may never think of the perfect response. Life does not provide rehearsals before difficult moments, and strength does not require perfect performance. Sometimes you respond well. Sometimes you respond poorly. Sometimes you understand what happened only after you have had time to process it. The useful question is what you can learn without turning the lesson into a punishment. Eventually, you begin to notice that the insult has less power when you stop trying to finish the conversation. You do not need the perfect comeback because your peace no longer depends on having delivered it. You do not need to imagine the other person's regret because their regret is outside your control. You do not need to keep proving that you deserved respect because your behavior can already reflect the standard you hold for yourself. The memory may still appear from time to time, but it becomes a memory rather than an active conflict. That is the difference between remembering an event and remaining trapped inside it. One can make you wiser. The other keeps you emotionally present in a place where you no longer need to be. The past deserves your attention when it has something useful to teach you. It does not deserve unlimited access to your peace simply because someone once behaved badly. You can take the lesson, adjust your boundaries, understand your own reaction, and then return to the present. The moment is finished, your life is still happening, and eventually, the most powerful response to disrespect may be realizing that you no longer need to continue the conversation after everyone else has already left. As your reactions become less automatic, something else begins to change. You start listening to disrespect differently. Instead of hearing every harsh comment as a statement about your worth, you begin noticing what the person's behavior may reveal about their own habits, values, and emotional state. A person who constantly needs to dominate conversations may be telling you something about their relationship with control. Someone who turns every success into a joke may be showing discomfort with another person's confidence. Someone who regularly humiliates others may simply have learned to create importance for themselves by making someone else feel smaller. None of this gives you permission to diagnose people from a distance. It simply reminds you that behavior has a source, and that source does not automatically live inside you. This distinction can change the emotional weight of an insult. Picture someone making a dismissive comment about your work in front of a group. The first interpretation might be that they have exposed some weakness in you, and now everyone must be seeing it too. But another interpretation is possible. Perhaps they are trying to establish status. Perhaps they are uncomfortable with your competence. Perhaps they simply have poor habits when communicating. You may never know which explanation is correct, and you do not need to. That is the important part. You can observe the behavior without becoming obsessed with discovering the hidden reason behind it. Their motive is outside your control. Your interpretation of the event is not. This is where Stoic discipline becomes more subtle than simply ignoring insults. You are learning to separate information from judgment. If someone points out a genuine mistake, there may be something useful to examine. If they communicate that criticism poorly, you can still take the useful part without accepting the unnecessary cruelty surrounding it. If someone attacks you without offering anything meaningful, you can recognize the attack without treating it as evidence. You still need the honesty to ask whether there is anything worth learning while refusing to carry the disrespect. That balance protects you from two opposite mistakes. The first is taking every negative opinion personally. The second is dismissing every negative opinion as meaningless. One makes you overly dependent on approval. The other can make you arrogant and closed to correction. A steady mind needs something between those extremes. You can listen without surrendering your judgment. You can consider criticism without accepting humiliation. You can admit a mistake without allowing someone else to define your entire character through it. This is what makes psychological presence powerful. You remain available to reality without becoming available to manipulation. Think about how differently a conversation feels when you stop trying to defend your identity. If someone says you are incompetent, you do not immediately need to prove that you are capable. You can examine the specific claim. If it is false, you can leave it where it is. If it contains something true, you can correct your behavior without needing the other person to become wrong. You can take useful information from an unpleasant source. The messenger does not have to be admirable for the information to be valuable, and the message does not become true simply because it was delivered confidently. The same principle works in the other direction. When someone praises you, their approval is also information rather than a final verdict. If an insult cannot define your worth, praise should not become the foundation of it either. Otherwise, you remain dependent on the reactions of other people, only with more pleasant emotions attached. Stoic stability asks for something deeper, an internal standard that does not rise and fall with every comment. You know which principles matter to you and which mistakes you need to correct. Because of that, outside opinions can be considered without becoming commands. Once you begin seeing people this way, social situations become less psychologically crowded. You no longer need to decode every expression or monitor every laugh to determine whether you are being accepted. You become more interested in patterns than isolated moments. One rude comment may be meaningless. Repeated contempt tells you something. A single disagreement may simply be disagreement. A person who repeatedly tries to undermine you is giving you clearer information about the relationship. This lets you respond with proportion instead of turning every interaction into a psychological story. There is another kind of freedom hidden inside this perspective. You stop needing to expose the other person. If someone behaves badly, you do not have to announce that they are insecure, jealous, or unhappy. You can leave the diagnosis behind. Their character is their responsibility. Yours is yours. That separation keeps you from becoming trapped in the same game you were trying to escape. If they seek superiority, and you spend the rest of the day proving how insecure they are, you are still allowing their behavior to direct your attention. You have changed the words, but not the structure of the conflict. Real composure, therefore, has very little to do with pretending that disrespect does not matter. It means you can see it clearly without allowing it to distort your judgment. You can recognize cruelty without becoming cruel. You can notice insecurity without mocking it. You can understand that another person's behavior may come from their own unresolved issues without turning that observation into another weapon. The person in front of you remains responsible for what they choose to do, while you remain responsible for what you choose to absorb. And eventually, that separation becomes almost automatic. A disrespectful remark arrives, and instead of immediately asking what it says about you, you notice what it says about the situation. You become curious before becoming defensive. You observe before judging. You decide whether the words contain useful information, meaningless noise, or a pattern that requires a boundary. You only need to remain faithful to reality and your chosen standards. Once you can observe disrespect without absorbing it, another person's opinion remains one perspective, never an authority over your identity or determine your worth. Eventually, the lesson becomes larger than knowing what to say when someone is rude. Difficult people become tests of whether your behavior is actually guided by principles or simply by whatever emotion is strongest in the moment. It is easy to appear composed when everyone treats you well. The harder test comes when someone gives you a reason to abandon that composure. That is where character becomes visible. The goal is not to become untouched by life, but to remain deliberate when life gives you reasons to lose your balance again. You may still feel anger. None of those reactions make you weak, they make you human. The important change is that your emotions stop having automatic authority over your actions. Anger can arrive without becoming an insult. Hurt can appear without becoming self-pity. Pride can rise without turning into a demand for approval. You create distance between what you feel and what you choose to do, and inside that distance is a freedom that becomes more valuable with practice. This changes the meaning of strength. Strength does not need to look like the person with the fastest comeback or loudest voice. Sometimes strength is staying quiet because speaking would only make the situation worse. Sometimes it is saying something firm because silence would allow a harmful pattern to continue. Sometimes it is leaving a pointless conversation. You also stop measuring yourself by whether you won the interaction. If your peace depends on correcting every misunderstanding, you have handed your peace to people you cannot control. A person can think badly of you while you continue living according to your standards. Someone can dislike your boundary and you can keep it. Another person can tell a distorted story about you, and you can decide that your life does not need to become a courtroom where you defend yourself before everyone. This is a quiet form of independence. You stop chasing approval from people who have shown that they are committed to misunderstanding you. That does not mean becoming arrogant or deciding that everyone else is beneath your attention. It means knowing when explanation has reached its useful limit. If someone genuinely wants to understand you, you can meet them with patience. If they are searching for a reason to attack you, endless explanation only gives them more material. Your responsibility is to communicate honestly. You are not responsible for controlling the conclusion someone chooses. Over time, this affects the way you enter social situations. You become less concerned with managing every impression. You listen more carefully because you are no longer preparing a defense for every criticism. You notice when a joke is being used to hide hostility. You notice when disagreement is healthy and when it has become a contest. You notice when someone deserves an explanation and when they deserve distance. You stop reacting to isolated moments and start paying attention to patterns. There is a strange paradox here. The less you need to demonstrate your strength, the more settled you appear. A person who constantly needs to prove that they cannot be disrespected can become easy to provoke, because anyone can challenge them and watch them respond. When your identity is not built around appearing powerful, the pressure to perform disappears. None of these actions threaten your identity because your identity is no longer dependent on looking invulnerable. That is close to the heart of Stoic discipline. The aim is not to eliminate emotion, but to bring emotion under the guidance of judgment. You feel anger, then decide what that anger deserves. You feel fear, then decide what courage requires. You feel hurt, then decide whether the wound calls for protection, reflection, or release. As Epictetus taught, no man is free who is not master of himself. The feeling provides information. It does not automatically provide instructions. This becomes especially important when another person's behavior pulls you away from your better judgment. Eventually, disrespect itself becomes less interesting. You no longer need to turn every encounter into a story about your status. A rude comment can remain a rude comment. It does not have to become proof that you need to become harder or a reason to spend the night planning revenge. You can handle what happened, learn what it reveals, and continue with your life. The event becomes smaller because you have stopped making your identity responsible for defeating it, and perhaps that is the deeper transformation. You began wanting to know how to deal with people who disrespect you without fighting. Eventually, you realize that the important part was never learning how to control difficult people. It was learning how not to let difficult people control you. You cannot decide whether someone will be rude. You cannot force another person to respect your boundaries, but you can decide whether their behavior will turn you into someone you do not recognize. That choice will not always be easy. That does not erase the work. You can return, examine what happened, and practice again. Character is built through repetition. Each time you pause instead of striking back, speak firmly without cruelty, or leave without needing revenge, you reinforce a different identity. You become someone whose peace is not dependent on perfect circumstances. Eventually, the question changes. It is no longer simply how to stop people from disrespecting you. It becomes whether their disrespect can still decide who you become. Their behavior belongs to them. Your character belongs to you. And when you understand that deeply enough, you no longer need to win every encounter to know that you have not lost yourself. You cannot control how people treat you, but you can decide what their behavior creates inside you. Protect your peace, hold your boundaries, and never let someone else's lack of self-control become your own. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. If this message stayed with you, choose one of the videos on the screen and continue the journey.